Hello, everybody. My name is Marty Sugerik. I'm an SREB instructional coach. I do a lot of work with career tech, and I'm here today to share with you a coaching method that I've had a lot of success with in working with career tech teachers who are trying to embed applied mathematics or even science or literacies. Can be applied for anything, but we're going to look at a math and CTA example today. So the first part of this process that I use in coaching is working with the teacher to engineer the acting of learning. And so what we mean by engineering is we're going to look at the standards like the flow chart that Leslie shared with you. You look at the standards in CTE. Now, a lot of math standards that are in CTE are embedded in the CTE standard. So we look for the verbs. And I'm going to use an example, and these are not all the math examples, but certainly measure, estimate, and compute are three common verbs that we see throughout all programs of study. This is reiterated in the Skills USA framework, where CTE focuses on these three types of skills, and one of them is technical skills grounded in academics. So we have leverage here to work with teachers that embedded applied math, literacy, science, social studies, any other interdisciplinary subject can be done through this technique of engineering the performance task. So we're going to take actually an MDC task, and I use a lot of these because they are contextual or related contextual, and a lot of them have some really good problems with the solutions already online. So we use these with math teachers, but they work really well with career and technical teachers. So as you can see, Leaky Faucet talks about estimating. And if you look at unit conversion and measurement and rates of change, it hits a lot of real powerful math concepts. But we start by looking at the verbs in the questions that are used here. And as you can see, both questions are only two. They both use the word estimate. So right then and there, we move on and I share the depth of knowledge, Webb's depth of knowledge chart with my CTE teachers to ask them, identify where does the word estimate fall in the different levels of highly effective questioning. And as you can see by the graphic on the right here, estimate falls with DOK2. So obviously right there, the coaching then becomes, can we or do we need to add some other DOK2? Do we need to add some DOK1, some prerequisite questions so we can start to build that scaffolding, reaching back possibly to get to students, to engage them at a little lower rigor level. And then we can also look at moving forward and moving beyond. So going to, can we ask a follow-up question on leaky faucet at level 3? And then even into level 4, which gets mainly into our project-based learning thinking. And so you can build that scaffold all the way up, and you can have multiple questions at each level. Again, that's where the teacher really needs to look at their students and ask themselves, do I need a couple DOK1 questions to start off? So writing scaffolded questions. The other thing we talk about in our coaching is scripting questions. This is something I had to do as a teacher, right? If we're truly facilitating student led active learning, right? Then we need to be armed with really good scripted questions so that when students ask questions, we are ready to answer their question with a question, right? Remember, that's part of that formative assessment and productive struggle. And so asking questions to students so they can answer their own questions. So it's not only writing the questions scaffolded with rigor through DOK, it's also scripting questions at each level so that as I bounce around and work with other students, I can have those questions prompts ready to go. So that's the engineering of taking a traditional worksheet that is really good. It's contextual, right? It does hit the standards, but already we've laid out how this is going to become even more active by simply looking at the verbs in Webb's DOK. So you can see some examples I put here for you. These are some that I've used before. So, you could have kids draw, label, and illustrate a diagram where water comes from and how it travels into Jan's faucet. This is actually getting into science with the water cycle, right? And we're using DOK1 level, but we're getting them to actually physically draw, label, and illustrate. And what I like is that you can use multiple verbs at each level. So we can have kids do two or three things at each level if needed. The two questions on the worksheet for leaky faucet were DOK2. DOK3, how about investigate the cost and formulate the amount of money that Jan will lose in a year? So again, the teacher may have to provide some background, some We do this, right? We can go to any water company or utility and access this information and give it to students or have them go to the website themselves, right? A lot of different ways to do that. But now we're getting into investigate, right? What is the cost of water? How are we charged for water? And that varies from state to state, rural, urban. So it's really a nice challenging thinking. Plus, it is real world. It's something they will do regardless of what class they're in. And then DOK4 gets really into pushing them into some critical thinking going beyond, right? How would you evaluate a similar situation if Jan left her lights on? So here we're using a related contextual that's in the research from the National Research Center with Jim Stone's work, right? Contextual, if I'm teaching plumbing, great leaky faucet. But now can you apply the situation to a similar related context with electrical. So learning how electricity is measured in our house and how we're billed for that. And then I like creating a 3-minute elevator speech to communicate your evaluation. Part of this comes from the Nat Geo training I took a year ago where, taking action. Once you do something, active learning really becomes now what do you do with it? Let's take action, have you do something with it. So communicate it through an elevator speech is just one example. So here's the engineering that we're doing for active learning by taking a traditional worksheet that's very nice, it's contextual, meets the standards, and yet we have already created a level of rigor that goes way beyond just the initial questions of estimate. And as you can see, all these verbs require some action. Now, the next level that I'm going to add to this is going beyond, and it's about the process in which we facilitate students working on this worksheet. This is where I think active learning really ties into simulated workplace, right? So we want to look at, if you are doing work and you're on your job, right? What does that process look like? And can we simulate it as teachers? And so years ago, I got into some research with world languages as a math teacher. We all know that math is a foreign language to a lot of people. So I looked at how do world language teachers teach, right? And I came up with a wonderful resource that's hyperlinked here. And they use something called 3 modes of communication, which is interpretive, interpersonal, presentational modes. Now, what's nice about these modes is they pair very nicely with the workplace, right? Sometimes you work alone, sometimes you work with other colleagues, other people on the job, and sometimes you have to present out to small groups. So there's a very nice parallel here between world languages and the workplace and how we communicate in the workplace. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually run that leaky faucet worksheet with this process. And so I included here some of the active learning within 3 modes of communication. So as you can look here, we're already into ELA, but we're also into employability skills because all of these modes are part of communication, which is any good employability skill, but they're also ELA. So we've already touched on interdisciplinary instruction. We started with math, we had a little science with the water cycle. Now we're getting into some ELA. So I love this because it's a great way to really consolidate multiple interdisciplinary connections, and that makes teachers much more efficient. So the 3 modes, we're going to look at them briefly here. Mode one is interpretive, working independently, right? And so I put in a diagram here, and basically we're going to simulate students working by themselves. So you could put kids into like a testing conditions kind of thing, give them a fixed time, and have them work on just the first question in leaky faucet, right? So we don't want to overwhelm them with everything. Let's just start with question one. After they move through that, we want to go in. We're going to use an employability skills rubric. This is something I modified years ago through PBL and made it a little more efficient for me as a teacher. So students have a copy of this collaboration and communication because one of the things we want to make sure students know in active learning is how are we measuring your active learning? And so this is a great way to look at collaboration and communication. And I've hyperlinked it. So if you want a copy of it, you can download it from the link above. Then we get into mode two, right? So after students work independently, we simulate, you're on the job, you're working alone. Now you have to work with a colleague. And so now we're going to go to mode two, interpersonal mode. And this is where we get students, right, to pair up. I like pairs and to have a discussion, deep discourse between the two. Now, one thing I like to do during this time where students are paired up and doing this is have them document their conversation. And so, one way we can do documenting discourses as a math teacher, I like a Venn diagram. It's wonderful for similarities and differences. But you also have thinking maps. You could use a double bubble map. And the bottom line here is that we want students to understand that there are similarities and differences in our thinking and how we solve problems, and that it's essential that we listen to other people, active listening, right? And listen to what they do, and then share what we do and find similarities and differences in our thinking. This really is students seeing each other as resources for learning, which is part of that formative assessment piece that we've been using. I also added this. This is something I borrowed when I was a teacher, and it's called providing meaningful feedback. So when my students are giving feedback with each other, again, active learning, a lot of kids struggle with this. So I give them prompts, right? I like that. It's always great to validate someone's work. So start off with that. How do you consider? This is where you may offer something, some information or tool or resource that they don't know or they're not aware of, and that you're actually giving them some of your information. And then there's that cool feedback. Hey, I wonder if. So I like to use these. And again, this is all part of active learning, right? So we're teaching kids not only the verbs in the worksheet, but we're having them actually go through the process and trying to simulate what they would do in the workplace. And then the third mode is presentational mode. And this is where, as the teacher's walking around and observing and listening to the pairs of students filling out their Venn diagrams and similarities and differences, and you're bouncing questions and you're documenting the OMGs that you're hearing from students, you're starting to identify pairs of students that can come up in front and speak to the whole group. There's that presentational mode. And this is a great way to simulate, right? Sometimes our boss, she or he may ask us to speak at a meeting. We may do shift turnover in nursing. So there's a lot of real world situations where the students need to realize that this is part of your job, that you will be faced with times where you're going to have to speak to a whole group, and not necessarily what many kids think presentation is in a huge amphitheater auditorium and you're at the mic, right? There are great ways to simulate small groups. So that's the third mode. And then I put in here, these are some of the pairs that I look for. So obviously look for a pair of students that has the right answer that can explain that. We're also looking for students who might have started off on the wrong track and then corrected through thinking, through maybe some of your questioning. And then we always look for students that extend, right? Kids who answer the question correctly, but add some additional information that was not asked of. So that's really pushing them to that next level. And I put in here a slide on facilitating discourse during that time, right? During the modes, students are critiquing their reasoning of others, and that's important, right? At the end of the process, the whole group discussion, we look for those higher levels of thinking and document those as well, pros and cons of all the different types of thinking. So that's where we can come back as a whole group and kind of consolidate all these different thoughts. And then you would just repeat this through the next question. So it's a great way, the process is a great way to simulate active learning through the workplace and the communication in the workplace. And then if you go back to the design, we're obviously using those verbs aligned to the standards, and we're building a scaffolded, engineered performance task for them. And the last thing I put in here is some of the teacher responsibilities, right? So that if you're a facilitator, we're observing, listening, and questioning, right? We're documenting what we're hearing, and misconceptions and gaps and things like that. And then you have some formative data that you can take back and use to change or improve your teaching technique. If you have any questions, you can please contact me. My email and name is hyperlinked here. I appreciate your time. Thank you very much.